Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the British Association for Holocaust Studies postgraduate workshop on teaching difficult histories. This is the last of Charlie and I's postgraduate events series online from this year as postgraduate reps for the BAHS. And today we are hosting this discussion to talk about the different ways that we can teach histories like the Holocaust and other challenging topics. We know that many PhD students teach alongside their studies, and so we've put this event together in the spirit of continuing professional development to help us all as we progress on that journey. The aim of this event is therefore to discuss some of these sensitive topics and the ways that we can teach these and engage with students about them. Today, we're honoured to be hearing from Dr. Rachel Pistol at King's College London, Dr. Amy Williams at Nottingham Trent University, and Nicola Woodhead, a PhD student at the University of Southampton. And I will briefly hand over to them each before we have a proper discussion so that they can introduce themselves and a bit about their research. So Rachel, would you like to kick us off?
Thanks, Barnabas. And so I'm Rachel Pistol. I have, my specialism is Second World War internment in the UK and the USA, but also refugee history, immigration. I am the coordinator at King's on the third phase of the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. So obviously I do work on Holocaust awareness and things like that as well. In terms of my teaching, I have quite a diverse mix because I also am a digital historian. So I teach refugee history, I teach about racism, civil rights, Holocaust awareness and research methods. I also do a lot of that as well. So I have quite a diverse mix of sort of what I teach, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Amy, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. So I got my PhD 2 years ago, which focused on how the Kindertransport is remembered and represented. So I look at particularly how different host nations remember and represent the Kindertransport, through different genres. I did teach a little bit during my PhD. I mainly taught on, or rather in European studies. So my PhD was obviously in history and memory, but I was teaching on a different course in a different area. I also had to teach about terrorism during this time. And then I've done 2 years of teaching now as module leader of the History and Memory of the Holocaust module. One during COVID and one obviously in person. And yeah, and then I've also taught on another module, like a part-time module, which was on a sort of more broader aspect of history in terms of sort of Europe through the ages, which looked at the Russian Revolution, the Troubles in Northern Ireland and Algeria as well. So like Rachel, you seem to teach on several different topics, but my particular topic is the Kindertransport.
Thank you very much, and thanks for being with us, both you and Rachel, and over to Nicola.
Thank you for having me today. So I've taught on a range of undergraduate courses, stretching from like a survey course from ancient to modernity, but I've also taught on courses that look at Jewish life before the Holocaust. I should introduce myself a bit first. So my research is also on the Kindertransport. So I look at the experience of the Kinder who came to the UK but ultimately didn't settle in the UK. So I'm looking at these global refugee journeys, either through forced deportations or choice to re-immigrate. So I've also taught the Kindertransport in the context of the Holocaust, but a lot of my teaching is through outreach and widening participation schemes. So I teach secondary schools and also post-16 education, and through that it's mostly Holocaust Memorial Day activities, the Kindertransport, understanding refugees, and looking at genocide in a broader context.
Thank you very much. So we'll now start with a brief discussion but led by myself and Charlie, but then we encourage all of you who are attending, if you've got questions, to add them as well, and we'll be happy to talk.
Cool. So I think the one thing that came out of all of your things was kind of not only a specific Holocaust / difficult histories as we kind of pitch the event, but also a broader, much more holistic view of teaching at universities, and also outside in a wider education. So I suppose a thought and opening this discussion, I suppose, is the differences, the specific challenges, the opportunities, perhaps, that teaching about difficult histories, whether that be, I mean, all of you are kind of refugee historians under a broad kind of a banner, which obviously I'm very pleased about because that's what I do. But this kind of banner which we put of difficult histories, with the Holocaust being at the centre, how does this differ from teaching other areas? Are there particular considerations that you need to have? Are there opportunities that otherwise wouldn't present themselves, perhaps? So is this kind of tied into kind of like a specificity type question? How specific do we need to be, or is it something that we can discuss more generally, I suppose? I don't know if anyone has any opening thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll go if you want. Yeah, I think teaching on a range of different modules, but also a range of different topics as well, has really helped me understand how I teach the Holocaust, but also how I teach other subjects. And there are so many crossovers and connections there. For example, teaching about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, for example, is obviously different to the Holocaust. However, we're using the same resources such as testimony, for example, and how we engage with that is very similar. Looking at different perspectives, looking at the complexity of testimony, but also, you know, how we approach, as you're calling it, these difficult histories, is a way to understand lots of different perspectives, as I've just said. So I think also because, as you said, we're sort of under the umbrella of refugee histories as well, you're constantly aware of past and present. So that's always sort of, I suppose, in your mind when you're teaching. So whether I'm teaching about something about the Kindertransport, which links to the present refugee crisis, or something about Northern Ireland, for example, which still relates to what's happening now, it's a constant discussion that you're having. You can bring all these sort of nuances in, but also new developments as well, with regards to contemporary events.
Yeah, I think just to build on like what Amy just said, there are definitely these parallels that you see across the periods and across topics, and also some of like the approaches. So although we naturally see like the Holocaust as like a difficult or emotionally demanding history, a lot of the histories that I've taught, I think by chance, a lot of them have dealt with very complex and very still emotionally demanding areas. Like when we've looked, for example, one of my classes, we were looking at like mass violence in the Roman Empire, which is very much out of my skill set. But a lot of the approaches we were using to reading like source material from the time was using these skills and these approaches that we use when we read Holocaust diaries, when we read oral histories or listen to them. So I think there are a lot of similarities and things that we can take from what we learn as refugee and Holocaust historians and use elsewhere where we teach.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's very little that is kind of easy history, you know what I mean? But it's the concept of obviously you have this responsibility, particularly when you're dealing with a subject like the Holocaust, because you do have a lot of disinformation out there. There is a lot of Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion, and so you find that there's that sort of additional layer of complexity on the top, because you certainly don't want to be playing into that. But as you're saying, I mean, there's certainly lots of very sensitive topics that, aside from the Holocaust, you know, civil rights, racism, all of these things which are very much in play today in politics. So again, you're coming back to, I mean, it's making sure that people understand the nuances within there, and they understand the contextualization of how this fits in, so that you're not just sort of plonking the Holocaust in the middle of, without giving some sort of sense also of how life was before, so that it's because you don't want to be feeding into those sort of stereotypes and just focusing on the victims of the Holocaust as being victims, because of course they're people. They were leading you know, their lives before any of the persecution happened. So it's very much sort of trying to get the scale of it, but also trying to make sure that you're also getting a very much an individual perspective, and highlighting that these people are not just numbers, they are living human beings.
I think, just to jump in, I was just going to say that, just coming on from what you both just said, that you know, sometimes you're teaching on topics that aren't necessarily you're well versed in them, for example, but then what I know about my teaching in terms of the Kindertransport really helps, because as Rachel said, for example, if you're talking about the civil rights movement, for example, well, I know Holocaust survivors that were involved with that, and while I'm not telling their story during the module, but there's certain aspects that I can draw on to help my understanding as well. Or, for example, the current refugee crisis, bringing in different voices, you know, teaching on European modules, for example. I am asked to teach about the Holocaust, but also more contemporary events. And I suppose bringing in personal stories is a bridge to both histories in some cases, or having roundtable discussions, and inviting those multiple voices in, just to jump on what you both were saying there.
There's also a point, something that you mentioned, Rachel, about kind of having these preconceived notions, that the fact is the Holocaust is a compulsory school subject. It's the only compulsory not subject within the history, within the curriculum. It's a compulsory element, so every student you teach in theory should have some sort of background, perhaps more than other subjects, and I suppose that lends itself to issues, not necessarily issues, but considerations that perhaps more than other subjects they will have this notion, and that is dependent on every school. And I suppose that, Nicola, you'll know that from doing kind of outreach work within schools, that we have to be mindful, I suppose, of what students come to universities with prior to that. Does anyone have anything to come?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just jump straight in. I think one of the really important things I learned quite early into teaching, particularly probably at post 16, is finding out what students know. And I try to do this in a very non-judgmental way by just asking students, what do you know about, and I'd say like the Kindertransport, the Holocaust. And these are students who theoretically have had relatively recently Holocaust education. And I think that's where you start to see, particularly where students have come from different secondary schools and are now in like a college, the variation in what they know. And then you do see like levels of Holocaust distortion that Rachel mentioned. You do see, I don't want to say as far as like denial, I've not seen that in students outright yet. I'm sure there are students who may not share that, but there are these misconceptions. And so some of the things that I have done as I have like tailored like classes towards this is trying to get students to think more critically about what they're told and how they understand certain terminology, how they understand events. And for me, what I have used like most is oral history, because speaking to some first years this year, only 2 of them had heard a Holocaust survivor in person. And so I think something that has really started to engage, like the first years I've spoken to, is a Holocaust survivor. And I think using oral histories as a way through to this, when like a survivor isn't always possible to present to the class, is something that I try to just weave into sessions, as a way also to stop them like listening to my voice the whole time.
Yeah, I think that kind of flows us on kind of to talking about how we engage perhaps with these resources, and what kind of resources or teaching tools we perhaps use within this broader vein of difficult histories or histories of conflict, say. So Nicola, you mentioned about the argument of oral histories, survivor testimony, and this kind of then how do we practically go about this? So we know that there are difficulties, we know that the misconceptions, blah blah blah. But practically then, the Holocaust is so, with such a wide range of sources available to us, and each mandates its own consideration, as kind of we all know, and also with broader history. So if we're talking about whose voices perhaps do we foreground? Are we exclusively using sources that perhaps teach us something, or do we want to use victim sources, more perpetrator sources, and how do we kind of balance all of this in a balancing act? I know that sounds awful at phrasing, but how do we put all of this into one teaching tool, I suppose. Yeah, and also it'd be interesting from what other units you've taught and done, what kind of sources perhaps you use to teach this.
Do you want me to go?
It depends very much on, sorry Amy.
Oh, no, you can go.
I think as Nicola was saying, also it very much depends on level, because of course when if you're teaching sort of primary school children, secondary school children, and then degrees, you're going to use different elements, and like Nicola was saying, that is like, if you look at any of the feedback from any Holocaust education surveys, if students at school hear an actual Holocaust survivor, it really sticks with them a lot more than anything else. And obviously, as the years go by, there are fewer survivors of the Holocaust who are still living, and then people are exploring some interesting digital solutions to sort of how you can actually sort of still have them speak to you. But this is why having such rich resources of oral histories is really, really powerful tool. But I mean, the good news is that there are a lot of really good resources that are being developed that actually people from any level can sort of dip into if they're not sure, if they haven't taught this before. Obviously it is very hit and miss depending on how much training people have received before they try and teach this. Particularly I'm thinking more at sort of school level than university level, but it's this challenge, as you say, because obviously you have a lot of sources from the perpetrators, you've got a lot of testimony from survivors, and then it's trying to balance that, because if you go, for example, if you're looking, say, at resistance in the Holocaust, that can take many different forms, from actually sort of armed rising up to just defiantly surviving. There's sort of everything on that spectrum, and then it's getting that balance between, for example, one example I'm thinking of is where you think about people who defied the Nazis, or whichever power was, sort of dominant in their country, to actually hide and rescue Jews. And there are some amazing stories there But you have to also remember that that's a very small proportion of the population, so it's kind of not going so far into this was happening everywhere, but then also not going the other way to just telling about all of the horrific things that are going on, so that then your students become really cynical. So it's trying to get a balance between, actually there are a lot of factors at play, you know, the history of individual countries, because the way that Jews were viewed in different countries before the Nazis occupied. I mean, I know the really difficult thing is there's no like really easy just pull out these 3 sources and you can teach a fantastic lesson on the Holocaust. I mean, that's sort of it doesn't exist, and it is down to your independence and also the area that you're on. But I mean, I think the key thing to take away is that if you're not sure sort of where you should be looking, there are some fantastic resources, like for example UCL's Holocaust education, USHMM have resources, Yad Vashem have resources. There are all sorts of places that you can look if you're not sure how to actually do a balanced lesson.
I find it fascinating that we've all people have all mentioned the importance of testimony, and particularly of hearing Holocaust survivors. And I know from my experience in HMD events that the power that a Holocaust survivor can have. Rachel, you touched on something there in terms of the digital and the new digital tools that are being developed here. I was wondering what the 3 of you thought about projects like Dimensions of Testimony at University of Southern California, where they're creating these sort of holograms of Holocaust survivors, where they've been recorded answering thousands of questions, and then an AI will be able to match a question you asked to a computer screen with a pre-recorded answer. What do you think the future of Holocaust education looks like with these sort of digital tools?
I think it's great that you can use such a variety of sources, as both of the speakers have said. At the moment, for my personal teaching, I do like a sort of we have a 2 or 3 weeks on just testimony, and we look at lots of different testimonies, and we have a sort of talk about best practice techniques. So I really wanted the students to interview survivors, and we planned, we looked at different testimonies, then we did a whole session on how to interview somebody, then we interviewed a survivor, and then we had a debrief and what that meant, and then we went through the recording and what sort of questions were we asking and those things. And then the week after, we looked at other forms of testimony and how they're being used. So for example, the survivors and the hologram research that's going on at the moment, but then also what the Anne Frank Museum is doing, using testimony through acting. So we looked at all these forms of testimony in relation to one another. So not necessarily just focusing on one and saying this is the future, but rather incorporating new techniques and new understandings of how we're using testimony, and seeing that in relation to, I suppose, older forms.
I'm coming from a digital research infrastructure. There's a lot of really exciting things happening, and I mean, that is one way to make it very personal. If people are walking around, say a museum, that you can still feel like you're talking to a survivor. I mean, obviously there are lots of other things that are being developed where you have to balance, is the sort of, are you getting a gamification going on here, or because you don't want to trivialize what's going on in the Holocaust. And I remember there was the thing in Minecraft about the creation of like a replica of Auschwitz, and you're thinking, well, how is that being used? Has that been created, as part of the game, or is that being created as part of education? Is that a way of reaching? Because I think you have to be, the big thing is, as we all know, because we all teach these things, is that you don't want to in any way come across as trivializing the Holocaust or focusing on anything that's gimmicky. And I think that's what you have to be really careful, especially when people are trying to reach new audiences and perhaps younger audiences, of trying not to make it gimmicky, because you want people to have like quite a significant takeaway, so that they actually think about it, rather than just go, oh, I did a puzzle about, it's like, it's got to be, you want them to you want them to think about it and think about you know, all the different sides and how it could happen, so that they can then draw parallels with things that are going on in the world today, so that you don't just sort of blindly walk into the same situation again, essentially. And I think that is very much a responsibility of people who teach anything to do with the Holocaust and refugee studies and so on, is that you're trying to open people's eyes as to how these processes happen, and what are the warning signs, what do you need to look out for, and what do you as an individual need to be doing in terms of taking responsibility for your actions and trying to influence society positively.
I think Rachel picked up on a really good point there with regards to museums as well. You know, often you can't always get a field trip in to go to a museum to see how digital things are presented, or how testimony is presented digitally in a museum. So thinking about that, like sometimes you can obviously go to a site and you can stand in front of the screen and talk to your students about this, but in a lot of cases you can't. So again, thinking about how do you, some people wouldn't have seen things like that in museums, so how do you then talk about that in the classroom, where you're literally showing a still photo of it and you can't really get the sort of same interaction there. I think is another interesting thing to think about. But just quickly going back to like all these different resources that we've been talking about, you know, especially Nicola and myself, we've both taught on modules that maybe are somebody else's module. So you're presented with material that you're sort of having to engage with that isn't necessarily part of your topic. So I would also, the advice there I would give is obviously read through the material and the sources, but then also, even if you know you're teaching on somebody else's module, have a quick look for other resources that you can engage with as well in a different way, or is there any other up-to-date things that you can incorporate into that teaching. And then every time that, I mean, I've taught a module now for 2 years running, and I've switched sort of some resources up. Some resources really work in an hour or two session, whereas other resources you can spend a whole session just talking about one resource. It's that sort of balance as well. So that would be like advice if you're either creating your own module or using somebody else's material.
I just want to quickly come back to the museum idea that you both sort of touched on. In one of the modules I taught on during the pandemic, we did sort of like a virtual field trip during the classes. So I know the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles has a 360 tour, so you can take the students like gallery by gallery, and you can immerse as best as you can, being thousands of miles away, in like the Holocaust gallery, and you can talk them through it. And we did that with museum websites as well, like picking up certain like artifacts in the collection. We talked about what would we want to see if we went to the museum, and that was a slightly different approach to looking at how Holocaust memory has developed, whilst taking the students as best as I can on like a museum trip of sorts, when it really wasn't possible to take them on a museum trip.
I think it's interesting. It's something that that made me think about what you were saying, is kind of like, hopefully it's out of it, but the impact of kind of like these digital ways, both of researching and of teaching too, is this kind of post-COVID world that we're kind of in. I'll say post, but this post-COVID world in which we're in, where we've adapted to teaching online, and kind of myself and Barnabas have kind of, we understand that we've done, all of our events have been online, and this kind of way of disseminating perhaps changes based on the dynamics in which we have. Also, I was thinking about, you mentioned about various different resources which are kind of coming to the fore more recently. And I know as digitization occurs more, it broadens our field to perhaps something that's unimaginable to a certain extent. Having access to sources across the world in millions and millions and millions of reams of stuff is perhaps sometimes difficult, to put it plainly, and especially with the Holocaust, I think, because there is so much effort within this topic specifically to digitize collections. There is funding for this. It's a I don't know, it seems more, the more we go down this road of making things accessible, which is obviously a good and noble effort, it also brings its new challenges of how do we actually navigate this, and for an undergraduate student, perhaps you're teaching, to then go, you have all of this, do something with it. How do you kind of like navigate, I suppose, this ever expanding world? I mean, like, you only need to look at Davina's kind of refugee map, or testifying to the truth map, that the crystal map of testimonies. Things becoming more and more and more and more, which is great for research, but also to then attempt to synthesize that, or not even attempt to synthesize that, as in how do you even begin to broach those sorts of issues? I mean, I suppose for areas kind of taking leading on with synthesizing this into kind of like one, a catalogue, I suppose is the right word, but like this kind of like bringing together everything into one space, kind of like shows you the breadth, which brings its own challenges, I suppose.
Yeah,
Rachel,
I can give you a really good example of that. The last piece of the module that I teach on is I think it's a great part of to end with, but it is really hard as well. It's to create a research poster on Holocaust Memorial Day. Now, the students can use, throughout the whole module, we've done history of the Holocaust and memory. We've looked at film, we've looked at poetry, we've looked at memorials, we've looked at museums, we've looked at denial, we've looked at national, transnational memory, and they really have free range. So as you said, like incorporating everything that they've learned into this one poster, they can either go down the route of what, as one group did, looking at a specific national memory of the Holocaust and how that's presented on that day, or some other people looked at the Holocaust in relation to the particular theme of that year in relation to poetry, or somebody looked at how 3 different countries remember the Holocaust and what do they do on that day. And they were using lots of different sources. So while you can't obviously reference on the poster because it just looks awful, but on the back in their footnotes, you could see that they'd engaged with museum websites, as Nicola was on about. They'd engaged with secondary literature, they'd engaged with primary sources. So all that was sort of brought together in this one project, which is really hard to do. Like I think it's a really great project. And then at the end, we put these posters up, and we had a Holocaust Memorial Day event where we had speakers coming in, and the students got to speak about their posters. So they also had that, very academic, I have to produce a piece of work, but then I also have the other skill of how do I present that work then. So it's a real project that you could engage with, trying to bring what you'd learned from the module, using lots of different resources, engaging with, as you said, from archives. We had some students looking at Slovakia, we had some students looking at Israel and Germany and Britain. They were using archives from all over the world, and engaging with memories from all over the world, and also scholars as well. So I think that's sometimes a way of doing it sometimes, in terms of actually how do you present that week by week. We have, I'm sure everybody has a, your sort of learning room that you go to each week. And for that week, for example, if we're doing Holocaust literature, you cannot talk about everything in one week. We have like a 3-hour session, an hour lecture and a 2-hour seminar. You can't talk about the whole topic in that amount of time. However, we may look at a Kindertransport novel and a poem by somebody that had survived one of the camps. We may look at something that is written after the event, and how these connect. And then you'd have a sort of longer reading list where you can go and find out other information. And then you may have several PowerPoints that look at the developments over time. And so you get the sort of broad overview, I suppose, a more specific example, and then where the new things are going. So I suppose that's how you would organise it in a learning room.
Yeah, and I think oh, sorry, Annabeth. So I was going to say, I think a big part of our job, I mean, that sounds great, Amy. I think a big part of our job is signposting people. So, I mean, you start them off by pointing out, you know, USHMM, Yad Vashem, Lavina, Erie, as you were saying as well, because Charlie, essentially you're right, it is, you know, it's a giant catalogue, and anything that's in there is something that we've already gone through to check that it exists. Now, obviously with COVID, everybody started going, how much is digitized? And you're like, well, you know, not as much as we'd like, although the USHMM is very they have digitization budgets that other archives can only dream of. You know, so we are sort of trying hardest, but it's about signposting and using reputable. It's just getting your students of whatever age to understand what reputable sources there are to start there, and then they can explore from there. But it's just making sure they know where to look first.
I think it's been really fascinating to see a lot of you talk about the different sort of places that Holocaust education happens in. We've spoken about museums, actual physical Holocaust sites, and then of course the classroom, in addition to now the new digital online classroom. How important do you think place is for where we teach about the Holocaust? You know, and this sort of has two levels to it. The one on the strictly academic university teaching, but maybe another, Nicola, that you can come into in terms of teaching to school students. I'm thinking about the Holocaust Educational Trust that runs its Lessons from Auschwitz program, where they take students to Auschwitz for a one-day trip. During the pandemic, they created a VR version of that, where you put on VR goggles and you could visit 3 locations there. How important is it that we can go to places like Auschwitz or an archive or a museum for education?
So most of my education takes place in a physical classroom. Apologies, I've got like very bad cough at the moment. So a lot of it is confined to a space that they are already in and that they are used to learning in. But what I try to do is to take them outside of that, even not physically outside of it, like I spoke about, like the virtual tours. And I think even that sort of being in a different, although it's the same location, really does play a part in how they engage. Like they are looking at different, like they are actively learning, they are actively looking at like the museum or the site. They are trying to like immerse themselves in a place that they're not there. And I think in that way, location is really important. And a lot of these students would have benefited if like they could go to a museum, if they could have gone to a like site in Europe, or like the Lessons from Auschwitz. So I think it does play an important role, but it can be replicated, not perfectly. Like there are of course limitations, but then that way it is more accessible. Like the Lessons from Auschwitz are only for a couple of students within the school, and through doing this, you can open it up to the other students as well. And I do like doing that with the whole class. But yeah, they're just my thoughts on it.
I just want to say how difficult it is though, like teaching in a particular space, such as a museum. Say for example, if you've got 30 students or 50 students, you cannot gather everybody in a space in an exhibition. It's just not possible. Recently, I think I've taken 2 groups now to the new Imperial War Museum, and it's a big exhibition, of course, but you can't stand there and talk to everybody about certain things. So I think you're teaching sort of, you have to sort of think about the whole trip. So on the coach, for example, down, we talked about what we were expecting. You know, well, what is the purpose of an exhibition? What are we going to see? Has anybody seen the old exhibition? What do we think of aesthetics? Why are aesthetics important? We talked about lighting, we talked about placement, we talked about how sometimes certain techniques can be used to overshadow or admit a particular narrative, or bolster it or confirm it in another way. And then when we got to the museum, I cannot get everybody in a corner, so you let them run through. So let them go around and then go to particular groups at a time and say, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that? Or at certain times when you think there's no other like visitors walking around, gather them in small groups and go through whatever you want to talk about with them. And then after the trip, you do like obviously like a debrief and say, you know, we talked about this at the start. What have you got any new thoughts about this now, or something like that? But yeah, as Nicola said, like it's great that you can have these virtual tours, but it is incredibly hard also to do the physical ones as well.
I think that's a really good point that you both make, and yeah, I mean, also because everybody processes information in a different way, you sort of want them to just go around. I mean, you, as you say, Amy and Nicola, you sort of prime them with like, these are the things you should sort of look for, but then they need to wander and have a look and read things and sort of, because everybody's an individual. I mean, I think teaching the Holocaust and related histories, it's not easy, but I think you also have to remember that, I mean, as good a job as you do, and as much as you try, you know, to do everything, people are still going to take away, like from the same lesson, they're going to take away an incredible number of different perspectives, even though you're like, how did you even get there when we were talking about this other thing? And so, you know, you can't take responsibility for sort of how people interpret. You can just do the best job that you can to provide them with places to look for more information, with a balanced view of things, and with giving like a full perspective of actually, you know, it was more than just what happened during the years of mass extermination, you know, like where did, because it's really important to get, and especially as refugee historians, I think, you know, that work, our work very much shows how important it is to show some of the lead in to it as well, like how did this happen, because, you know, not every single German was a Nazi, and yet, you know, how do you get there?
I think also, like you mentioned something that just said, Rachel, about you just said teaching the Holocaust is difficult, it is challenging. So I suppose something we haven't yet really discussed is how we approach the sensitive nature of teaching histories like this, teaching histories of genocide, teaching histories of persecution, of racism, of conflict. Both, I think it's important within this question both to reflect upon both the student and the person teaching, because it's not easy to teach and to discuss things that are outside of the experience of most of us. How do we tackle these issues of scale, these issues of the reality of many of the situations in which we teach about? I think it's an important question to kind of like note that it's not easy. To teach these things are just as easy both on ourselves but also to the students. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about not necessarily how to navigate it, because obviously it's different for every person, but some of the perhaps considerations or views to make that easier or more workable.
I've definitely cried in a classroom, not full on, you know, cried, but when we've been looking at or listening to a particular testimony, or I was telling the student recently about a particular survivor who's recently passed, and I got really well, you know, I wasn't uncontrollable, but you know, the emotion was there. And I think that's fine to show, you know, like you've all said, it's a difficult topic. Often the survivors, you know, well, and you're telling them their stories to the classroom. We recently did an interview with a Holocaust survivor and a child survivor of the Bosnian genocide together. And that was incredibly, you know, one minute we were laughing about something and one minute we were, you know, really engaged in deep personal conversation. And it's good for the students to see that, because it's not all doom and gloom. These people live incredible, interesting lives, that it's not just about a particular one experience they've been through. You know, you get to see their personality, and I think that's also important for the students, as well. As Rachel said, you know, they're people. You know, we're not just talking about one experience. You know, when I interviewed Kinder, I'm not just interested in what happened to them in the 30s. I want to know what they went on to do, their spousal relationships, that, you know, the careers that they have, you know, travel and all these different things. So I think that's fine to incorporate into the teaching. But I think, yeah, I always say, for example, if there's a particular image or there's a particular piece of testimony or source that we're going to use, I will say some of you, you know, might want to step outside, or, you know, you can look away, or, you know, you're allowed to deal with it how you see fit, sort of thing. So I think being open and you know, being sympathetic is the best way to be, really, especially because I've had some students whose grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and it's actually really nice after when you know they've spoken to me about that, after, you know, asking them questions, you know, how did you find the session, you know, if they want to tell you a bit more about their family story, allow that, take the time with them. So
yeah, I think they're like really like points that I'd also echo. Like, one of the things as well, like, you don't know who you're teaching. Like, I taught in schools people who, like, either their parents or themselves have fled persecution from more recent conflicts. So you don't know how what you're talking about, although it may be like from the past, it may really resonate on a very personal level. So as far as possible, I try to, like, not warn, I just tell students what we're going to be encountering that day, what we're going to be encountering across the course, and that, as Amy says, like, deal with it as best you see fit. And also, yeah, like, I think emotions have a place in this history. Like, it is like, it's not an easy history. Like, as Rachel said, I think at the start, like, there's very few easy histories. And within that are complexities, there are emotions, and especially when you are, like, talking about people that maybe yourself have interviewed or people who you know very well, like, it can definitely hit. And even if you talk about it, I don't know, like 4 times every week, again and again, every year, on a different day, it might just hit slightly differently. You might have a different reaction. And I don't think there's anything like shameful or to hide away by having like emotions, like, to what we research, to what we study, to what we teach. And I think they're very valid and useful in this scenario.
Just to jump in there, that they can be so valuable, as what Nicholas said, you know, these personal deep connections that you make. I know some students have followed a particular survivor on social media and engaged with their story way after their university lives. You know, they go on wanting to know about their story, whether they go into Holocaust education or not, you know, if they go into a total different career, but they still nevertheless want to, you know, connect with that person and see how they're doing. So I think that there's also like a longevity to that as well. It's not just about what you're teaching there and then. These relationships and these connections last way beyond a module.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of questions that we have now from the chat. The first of which is from Annabelle, who asks, have any of you taught much with second generation testimony? And if so, how have you noticed the engagement is with that type of testimony compared to others, such as that from survivors? And are there any differences in the interpretation and the meaning making that students have then responded to with that?
You go first than me.
Yeah, brilliant. So I've not actually taught with second generation like oral histories, but I have taught with second generation who have turned their parents' like stories into books. And so I have taught using that. And I think one of the interesting things that comes out of conversations through that is how children have mediated their life experiences through their parents. And engagement with that has still been like very high. Like there are different questions being asked, like maybe why were certain things involved in like how they have understood their parents' lives, but the engagement has still been strong, I found, throughout. It's still, because it's talking like on a personal level, people make these connections with individuals, and I think that is still very strong, and something that resonates still.
Definitely. I have taught with second generation testimony, but also with them in the room as well. And yeah, just to echo what Nicola said, that the attention is wonderful to see in the students. They literally hold on to every word, but also asking so many follow-up questions, wanting to know about, for example, how second generation are returning or seeking reconciliation or identity struggles, or wanting to know how, you know, how they were told this story and how does that relate to the present refugee crisis, for example. But then also it's a jumping off point to go and wanting to know more about the particular survivor's story as well. I think using second generation testimony is really interesting because we can think about memory. I look at it particularly from a national and transnational perspective, as well as obviously personal. So how I've used second generation testimonies to look at how they confirm or challenge a particular narrative, and how often second gen testimony it can be used, especially in certain events, commemoration, for example, or certain commemoration around memorials, as a sort of I suppose a transnational memory agent to sort of, you know, bring different testimonies together to especially these second generation networks that are really sort of reaching out across borders to remember and bringing different national memories together, and how that sort of is shaping or modifying our memory.
I think just to quickly add to that, when you've got second generation like Holocaust, especially if they're familiar with their parents' stories, then I think that can still be a very powerful tool. And it also shows, as Amy and Nicola have said, you know, the generational trauma as well that comes through, and some of the things that, so it can be really useful. I think where that can be problematic is, say, for example, in internment history, I come across a lot of second and third generation who might not know really anything about their parents or grandparents' internment, and so they tend to come out that there's a real difference when talking about internment in between, so because internment was obviously very different. Some people found it, you know, incredibly traumatic. Some people just sort of glossed over it, you know, in terms of things. Some people said, well, you know, in comparison with what we would have experienced had we not been in the UK, like it really wasn't a big deal. And when you've read sort of hundreds and thousands of sources about this, you sort of see that the majority sort of fall into it wasn't pleasant, but we understood what happened, and then mercifully we were able to get on with our lives, and obviously many family members weren't able to. But I come across a lot of second and third generations who don't know that much about it and say this is the worst thing that the British have ever done. It was absolutely awful. How dare they treat refugees in this way? You know, there can be no excuses made for it. And you think, well, actually you're taking a very different perspective than your parents, and perhaps you don't know as much about sort of what happened. So I think with that second and third generation, you do have to be careful with how much they actually know about what transpired. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that what they're saying isn't valid. It's just that, you know, it's sort of understanding where that is coming from.
I think I want to ask one more question, or pose one more question from Angela, because I think it's an interesting one to kind of end our discussion on. So earlier, Rachel and others of you have mentioned the word kind of like lessons. And this is a contentious point about why we do these type of histories. And it's one that I don't think is a clear-cut answer, but equally is highly problematic in many senses. So what, in as a shorter answer as you can, what lessons, if we can use that word, do we want to take away from this? And is this different for if we're teaching undergraduates versus school kids? Should it be the same? And do you think there is an applicable thing? We mentioned at the start about this time between past and present, about linking issues. Do we think that's a genuine thing that we can do, or slash should do? I mean, we could do a whole discussion on that. It's not an easy question. So I think there'll be a nice one to end on, though, just to add in a bit of difficulty.
Yeah, and just to clarify, because so when I say lesson, I mean, like, we don't teach the Holocaust obviously just to give people like a lesson or a takeaway or something like that. And yeah, it is a really contentious issue. But I think you know, one of the things of why we're teaching this is to show actually, you know, what can happen when people don't take a stand, and that knowledge is something that, whether we explicitly say it or not, is something that students, particularly if you're dealing with undergrads or postgrads, they should have the critical thinking to go, oh wait, I can draw some similarities between what's happening now and with what was happening there. I mean, we're just, you have to teach these difficult histories in order to help people understand where people have come from, and also what, you know, how you can easily go down that road again when people don't have awareness of how history influences the present.
Yeah, I think for me, obviously, a lot of my work is around testimony, and to keep these memories alive, so students engage with these voices that they may not know about otherwise, or for example, what I was saying earlier about this last project, a lot of the speaking with a survivor, I know a lot of students went home and told their parents. So, you know, they're sharing that story, they're taking that out into their own communities, and I think that's what I really value as well from seeing that happen.
Yeah, I don't ever go into any times I teach like a difficult history thinking like, in this hour I can teach someone a lesson on humanity, I can teach them that, you know, hatred is wrong. Like, if that is something that they truly believe, it takes a lot of like unpacking themselves that me teaching about discrimination, teaching about genocide, teaching about the Holocaust isn't going to undo. So I guess the thing that like I maybe hope students take from is the ability to listen more, to sort of like listen to these testimonies, to listen to these oral histories, but also particularly when I'm talking to students before they're at university, is to think more critically. A lot of like students under 16 sort of do just take some things as fact. They're like, I have been told this thing, therefore this must be true. And I really just hope that by presenting like some nuance and some maybe slightly uncomfortable histories within the Holocaust, and uncovering some of the misconceptions that they held true at the start of the session, that they start to question what they just assume is fact. And hopefully then that, as like Amy and Rachel have both touched on, sort of like builds more of a like lasting impact, where they follow these stories, they see these people not as just victims but as individuals with personalities and likes and dislikes.
I think that's a great point to end on, actually. The ability to listen and to think independently, I think is a general, you can't disagree with it. So yeah, thank you very much to Nicola, to Amy, to Rachel for your time, and to kind of close off mine and Barnabas's events series with, I think, a really interesting discussion on actually the practicalities of what we do. It's nice to kind of do the deep academic empirical histories, but also I think to take a step back and reflect perhaps upon something that we actually all have to do. I say have to sounds bad. Have to do in terms of that we want to engage with these histories in an educational way, but obviously, as we've discussed, that can be sometimes challenging due to various different considerations. So on that note, I will close the meeting there and thank all of you for your time, and for those that listen, and for those that will watch it online afterwards. So yes, on behalf of myself and Barnabas, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you very much. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.